any hair or any other type evidence. There's never been any photos that have come forward. I've heard of a few, but I was never able to get my hands on them because either the folks got freaked out or erased them, or they were too old and they were lost. So unfortunately, I never could find any further evidence than that. So, but there's quite a good case of visual sightings. So, you just have to go with that.
Sure. But and in terms of the visual sightings, I mean, are we talking about a creature that, is sort of the size and appearance of, the sort of Pacific Northwest Bigfoot, or is it kind of more like the smaller skunk ape of Florida or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I kind of get the feeling it's somewhere in between. It's,
okay.
It doesn't, it just the general description is usually approximately 7 foot tall, maybe 300 to 500 pounds, hairy, but with longer hair, maybe more scraggly. The hair could be maybe 4 inches long. That possibly has aggressive tendencies. There's a few of the sightings where it kind of displays an aggressive behavior. So to me, it kind of falls somewhere in between the skunk ape and your traditional Bigfoot, which kind of seems natural. I mean, he lives in a much more a hot environment, a swampy environment, so it could be leaner and meaner. That would just be natural, more than a bulky type animal that may live in a colder, more northern environment,
Okay. And is it described as more humanoid, or is it more ape-like in appearance and kind of style, if you like?
I think the majority you'd have to say ape-like. I mean, it was upright, bipedal, but the descriptions of the face vary just a little, depending on how well somebody saw it. And some even described it as man-like, but in general, it most of the sightings give it more of an ape-like feel, as far as I can tell.
Okay, all right. Well, now we've sort of covered the creature in fact and reality. How did that then? Can you go into more detail as to how that got translated into the movie and what kicked that off? And again, what the locals thought about it, what the response was, etc.
Well, yeah, it was really an interesting and fascinating process of how the movie was made. Like I said, once Charles Pierce decided this would be a good topic, he went down to Falk, and of course he got somewhat of the same reception I did. Here comes a guy with a film camera now pointing in people's faces and wants them to tell the world about how they saw a hairy monster. So you can imagine the reaction he got from a lot of people was, forget it, you're not going to put me on film, But on the other hand, there were a lot of people that were willing to tell their stories and in some cases reenact it themselves. So what he did was just, find the locals that were willing to work with him, and he would shoot them with no dialogue. He would just have them act it out, tell them what to do. You see a monster, you run, that sort of thing. And then later he planned to do some narration over it. And that was because it was such a low-budget affair that he just didn't have the equipment and the crew in order to a lot of times record the sound out in these remote places. And so, to get other people to participate, he literally would sit up at the gas station and they would see somebody and said, oh, she looks perfect to act out this one sighting. And they would just go up to her and go, excuse me, ma'am, would you like to be in a movie? We're like, what I got to do? Well, you just got to run out in this field and act like you're scared of the Falk monster. And yeah, which is just crazy. And people would do it. And so, he was able to piece together things like that. And the way he was able to film a lot of the nature scenes and back in there in the remote swamps, he enlisted the help of a guy named Smokey Crabtree. And the Crabtrees play significantly into the history of the creature because Smokey's son, Lynn, had a really good sighting in 1965. And that's kind of what brought them to the attention of everybody who would come down there for newspaper stories in the 70s. So naturally, Charles Pierce was introduced to Smokey Crabtree, and he hired Smokey to be sort of a tour guide and to take him out in the swamps so he could film the nature scenes. And Smokey as well helped him to kind of, convince the other folks that, hey, this guy's not too bad. He's making, what we think is a pretty good movie, so you should talk to him. And so, Smokey helped considerably to get the movie done. And so once he had filmed all the scenes, he now had to take them and find a way to edit them, because the basically, and a lot of people don't realize how hard this was back then, because nowadays, I mean, everybody probably has some friends who's made some home movies. I mean, you can pick up, you can buy your own handheld camera, even a high def camera now. You can edit this thing on your computer. You can do it all. I mean, you can, I got plenty of friends that are making a zombie movie or something on their own. But to do this back in 1971 with a startup filmmaker and $100,000 budget was just extremely hard. So in a way, Pierce was very much a pioneer of kind of this do-it-yourself filmmaking, what I call guerrilla filmmaking, no pun intended. But, so he had enough money to buy the film, which was expensive, to rent the camera, and now he's out of money. So what he did was take all the footage out to Hollywood and found an editor that was willing to donate the time in exchange for a piece of the profits. So this guy, helped him to edit it and actually wrote the music for the movie and put that all together. So now Pierce had a finished movie, and he owed a lot of people money at this point, but at least he had a finished movie. And so now he's trying to go to some of the Hollywood distributors and say, hey man, I got this great movie, you check it out. And they didn't want to have nothing to do with it. I mean, first off, he's an out of towner. Second, he's got a Bigfoot movie. You know what I mean? It was tough going there. So they were like, forget it. So, but he owed a lot of money. I mean, had a big businessman out of Texarkana saying, calling down there every day saying, where's my money? Because by now, Pierce owed him about $120,000. And so Pierce is kind of sweating it, but he had, seen his own final product. He goes, man, this is a great movie. It's going to scare everybody. So what he did was go take it down to Texarkana and rent out a movie theater himself. And he paid the projectionists, he paid the concessions people and the people that took the money. And this was a process known as four-walling. It wasn't uncommon, but it was kind of hard to do. But basically, he just did it himself and decided he's going to show that movie down there and take his own money. Well, the day it debuted, there was already lines around the block because everybody knew what the Fouke Monster was down there. It had been in the paper. And so this just continued. I mean, it was sold out, show after sold out show, and he's just raking in the money, and it was a huge hit. I mean, the previous audience would come out screaming out of the theater, which included kids because it had a G rating. So, I mean, it was scaring the kids. The kids are screaming. The adults are jumping. So this kind of just fueled the whole thing, not unlike all those sightings did for the papers. And so he had another outtake reel, which he took down to Shreveport, Louisiana, and started doing the same thing. And it was the same thing, sold out shows, lines around the block. And so by this time, of course, now here comes Hollywood. Hey, man, you remember us? He's like, I don't think I remember you. I don't recall your name. And so, I mean, he was a good businessman. And so now he knew that he had a good movie and he knew he could call his own shots. So basically he said, fine, you write me a check for $1 million plus taxes and I'll give you 50% of the movie. And they're like, oh, you're out of your mind. He's like, well, then to take, leave because I'll just sit here and keep showing it. and so they eventually cut him a check. And so it's just one of those I don't know, a winning lotto ticket. I mean, the guy made a great movie, but he just did it in the right way, and he kind of piggybacked on that hype in the news stories, and the timing was perfect. And in the early '70s, you had you had the Patterson film that had come out in '67. There was another Bigfoot movie in 1970, but it was just at the start of the wave of kind of that 1970s Bigfoot boom, and he was just right there at the right time. And so that's kind of how he ended up doing it. And, he was a pioneer in many ways in what he did.
But do you think that kind of, low budget, do it yourself, handheld approach actually sort of lent something to, like the character and the legend of the movie? It wasn't just, like another Hollywood slasher Bigfoot type movie or whatever.
Oh yeah, I think definitely. I mean, it was kind of an unintentional benefit that it was filmed in that sort of rough looking style, and he did it with a docudrama. I mean, it looks like. I mean, I remember when I saw it as a kid, I couldn't understand. I thought, how in the world did they have film cameras down there at the very time this was going on? And he saw the creature. I'm like, as a kid, I couldn't understand because it looked so real. It was like the camera was there when this, young girl saw it out the back window of her rural house. And so that was a benefit. And ironically, later, you have movies like the Blair Witch Project. Well, the directors of the Blair Witch Project just flat out said, hey, we wanted to make a movie like The Legend of Boggy Creek. But they intentionally wanted to do that, and they used they kind of started that found footage, realistic, what's on this camera type thing. Pierce just kind of stumbled into it. I mean, it's just the way his movie ended up looking, so unbeknownst to him, he kind of set off, was an influence to these later directors that kind of picked that up. And of course, Blair Witch kind of went on and influenced a lot of other movies, I think. And I don't think people realize or give the props to Charles Pierce for really being kind of the first guy that did this in the horror movie realm. And so it's really cool that it's had that kind of influence. And hopefully I think with my book coming out, I think people can kind of see the whole picture and realize, oh wow, that really was something of a movie. I mean, it's, there's cheesy parts in it, and when you look at it now, of course, but it was made in 1971 by a first-time filmmaker. So all that aside.
But you think overall it's kind of stood the test of time?
Yeah, I think so. If I look at it now, the biggest stumbling blocks is some of the music in the middle. It kind of goes into this kind of a Disney educational film or wildlife picture type section where Charles Pierce is actually singing on one of the songs, but it kind of breaks the mood. It needed a little better soundtrack, but at that time, that's kind of what was going on in the movie industry. So I think if you just kind of overlook some of the music sections that kind of draw you out of the suspense, other than that, it's still suspenseful. He keeps the creature at a distance, and you don't see a lot of just goofy rubber costume thing going on. And I think he was wise to do that. I mean, he said our costume didn't look good, so I wanted to keep it in a distance. But and of course that kind of upheld the mystery of it, which made it even scarier.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place, Lyle, that we take a break, to have a few minutes commercial break for the station, and we'll pick up after the movie, sort of what's gone on sort of post Boggy Creek as far as the reality is concerned, what happened after the movie. So we'll take a break now and come back in about 3 or 4 minutes. Hi, this is Nick Redfern again, your guest host tonight on Epic Voyages, which is on InceptionRadioNetwork.com. And our guest tonight again, Lyle Blackburn, author of the new book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, which tells the real story and the background to the legend of Boggy Creek, which I'm sure many of you all know about. And it's a book I definitely recommend to anybody who's interested in not just cryptozoology, but also the way in which reality can actually shape fiction. As Lyle pointed out, the movie, a lot of people I think assumed was just a movie, not realizing the backstory behind it. So I think that's an important thing that we discussed in the first 45 minutes. For the second 45, or at least part of it, one of the things that I mentioned before the break, Lyle, is if you could talk about sort of what came post the movie, in terms of sightings, and how the legend has developed, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the 21st century.
Yeah, and like I said, a lot of people always thought, oh yeah, that all happened back in the 70s, and it kind of got quiet there for a while, and that when I first started looking into the story, that was pretty much my impression. I thought I was going to be doing research into something that had already happened and had pretty much died away. But quite the contrary, as I started going into the town and asking more people and getting in touch with more of the Bigfoot groups around in Texas and the area, I found out that, wow, there is definitely still sightings down there and some really good ones. So basically, to take you from the movie, which was in the 70s, as the movie kind of hit and got really big, like I said, the paper just didn't want to have anything to do with the sightings anymore. It just kind of played out. The story was old, and they were moving on to something else as far as what the readership was wanting. So you don't find a lot of reports in the paper at that time from about 1974 on, whereas, before 1974, you could find them. So, it somewhat died away from the public's eye. But if as I started talking to people who had lived there and lived there all their life, they said, we always kept our eyes open and our ears open for people who would report sightings. And of course, after the movie came out, you did have a lot of yahoos that, were seeing it right and left. And, they just kind of have to throw those out as just part of the hysteria or the hype or the Fouke monster mania. But the locals could point me to people who lived there and, certainly by now knew of the Fouke monster, but people who were trustworthy and credible and weren't caught up in the whole mania about it. And so I have some good sightings, by a young man that saw it in 1981 down in. They have a house in a place called Jonesville, and Jonesville is connected to Fouke because it's a little community about 5 miles southwest of Fouke. That this is where a lot of the sightings in the 60s happened. And Jonesville is a very remote place, and the houses there are very spread out. I mean, it's very just a country community is basically what you could call it. And it kind of backs up against the Sulphur River Wildlife Management Area, which is like 20,000 acres of remote bottomlands that spreads out. And the Mercer Bayou is part of that, the Sulphur River. So down in Jonesville, it's just a prime area where it's possible that a strange creature like this may just stroll by and somebody could get a glimpse of it. And that's what occurred in 1981 when this young man, he was 14, he was fishing down there in his pond, and it was just about dusk, and they fish really weren't biting that much, so he kind of slowly paddled around a little dog leg in the pond to try it one more time just on the other side. And he'd been hearing some disturbances, something moving around in the leaves prior to this, but he thought, it's It's our neighbor's bull. It's kind of rustling around over there. The leaves were on the ground. It was February. So, he didn't think much of it. But as he kind of went around this little curve in the pond, right then he saw something walking in the leaves away from him, and it was only about 60 feet away. And he saw the back of it. It was an upright, hair-covered creature of some sort that continued walking, walked up a little embankment, and disappeared over that. Well, because the guy was in his little rowboat and moving very quietly, the creature never saw him, but he was able to see it. And so at this point, naturally he got really frightened and thinking, what did I just see? So he rose to the side of the pond, kind of makes some noise, gets out, and then he heard, then he could hear the creature running. And so, this just really freaked him out, and he himself just took off running back to the house. So that was one of the prominent sightings. I interviewed this young man. I interviewed his father, who was there shortly after he returned to the house. And these are just very upstanding people, members of the church community down there, locals. They weren't caught up in that hubbub that was going on. So these are the kind of sightings that really intrigued me. I mean, it's one thing, these things in the paper, but the kind of behind the scenes, the sightings that nobody had ever reported. Until now, nobody's ever heard of this sighting until I put it in the book. It was funny because people would say, "Oh, you need to talk to so and so because this kid down there was feeding the monster back in the '80s." So there's all these like wrong impressions of what actually went on. And as I finally got the name and finally the number and talked to this family, they told me, no, here's what actually happened. And, it was stark reality about what this guy's telling me. He saw it from 60 feet away and had a really, really good view of it. And it's just hard to explain that away. And that's just one example of a good sighting in the 80s. About a decade later, in the early 90s, there was 2 sightings in which more than 5 people saw the thing at one time. So in these cases, you've got multiple witnesses, and again, I talked to and interviewed multiple witnesses that saw this thing at one time, which is, really makes the sighting stand out, and I cover those. So there's really good ones in the 90s, and then on into up until 2010, I had interviewed a girl who saw a creature fitting this description run across the road down there. So, while there was some movies made during these times. There was some sequels, and they're god awful, and I cover them in the book. I mean, I don't know, have you ever seen that Boggy Creek 2, Nick?
No, I haven't seen it, no.
Okay, yeah, you're...
I didn't miss much, I guess.
Yeah, they of course never could live up to the original. I mean, by any means. They did a Return to Boggy Creek, and they did a Boggy Creek 2 that Pierce actually directed Boggy Creek 2. But these things were just attempts by mostly the movie studios to capitalize on the fame from the Legend of Boggy Creek, make a sequel, as they do. And they were doing it back then. People complain about sequels now. They were doing it back then. So, so you kind of had this stuff going on, but, those kind of became disconnected from Falk. They weren't filmed in Falk. They weren't a part of the fabric that was going on in the locality down there. So that just pretty much left the locals to talk about and discuss these sightings among themselves. And really, until I started going down there and really kind of digging around, did a lot of these come out. So it just took some legwork on my part to kind of go in there and, like I said, in a serious way, and get people to talk to me. So,
okay. And you actually got some good illustrations, although we don't have photographs. You've got some real good illustrations in the book, don't you, of renderings of what the creature's supposed to look like.
Yeah, yeah. I thought that was important. I mean, the artist I used is his name is Dan Brereton. He's actually a quite famous comic book artist. He does, and when I say comic book, you may think it's kind of comic-y, but it's not. He mostly does covers, and he does these very killer paintings. He's got a really unique style, and he's very good at kind of monsters and mysterious looking stuff. And I had worked with him before through the band. He does some of our album art. So I thought, how cool would it be if I gave him about a dozen sightings and gave him the description and kind of a thumbnail that I sketched out and had him do something of like a crime scene sketch, a drawing of what was being reported in these sightings. And so he did a great job, and people commented a lot on the art. I thought it was important to have good art, and all that. So, I mean, cryptozoology art can vary from good to bad. So, and rather than include a bunch of just random pictures, I had one artist do all the illustrations, and that kind of gave you a sense of the creature. And I always enjoyed books where you could, even there's no picture of the actual creature, but at least there's a drawing, kind of